Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Julia Joja. I teach European security at Georgetown and George Washington, and I'm the director of the Black Sea program at the Middle East Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague Dalibor Rohac, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Our special guest today is Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University, the coiner of the concept soft power. We will be asking all about soft power in Ukraine and Russia, but until then, on our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to security, politics, and culture in Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us start with our first segment, which is the news from the Eastern Front. Today, as in many instances all across the Atlantic, from the battlefield all the way to this side of the Atlantic, the eastern side, as President Zelensky is already in the United States. He is in Scranton, Pennsylvania for a first visit to a production site, factory site for crucial 155 millimeter rounds that Ukraine is using in the battle against Russia. And then on his way to the White House with a meeting with President Biden, as well as to the General Assembly, where he will be presenting his peace plan and probably making some important remarks around where we are in the context of this war, as well as in the context of increasing rumors, speculations, discussions, details about a possible peace plan. I'll turn over to Dalibor in a second, but the two, things that I have to add here is that I think we're talking about the same 10 points peace plan that Ukraine is putting forth, and that is either very little commented on by Western leaders or oftentimes dismissed as insufficient or far too difficult to achieve in current times. So we're increasingly talking about alternative peace plans in the current context, in which Zelensky says the force ratio, the ammunition consumption ratio, is 12-1 in favor of Russia. And what we should be expecting, I don't know about the General Assembly, so I'm turning this question to Dalibor, but I thought it was telling one specific comment, or in this case tweet, about the visit to the White House. And this was now me quoting Gary Kasparov, who said what we should be expecting on Twitter, or X now, what we should be expecting from this visit of Zelensky to the White House is that he will be offered one spoon, half a fork, and no knife. Dalibor, what are you expecting from Zelensky's visit to Washington and the General Assembly in New York?
And it strikes me as difficult that either Biden or Harris would produce anything sort of substantive 6 weeks before an election in the United States. It's very obvious to me that they will want to play it safe, that we won't really see anything coming out of Anga or whatever bilateral meetings Zelensky might have in the US. That said, I think it was a great move to go to Scranton and meet with workers on the factory floor and speak directly to swing state electorate in the United States. I think that was a good move that many people have been sort of suggesting for a very long time, that the Ukrainians sort of take this route as opposed to just coming to Washington and speaking to the administration and the Hill. When it comes to the peace plan or the victory plan, I've always been a fan of parsimony and trying to sort of put things as succinctly as possible, although I don't live up to that standard myself very often. But my peace plan is a 1-point peace plan, if I were to come up with one. And my 1-point peace plan is essentially about bringing Ukraine into NATO and extending Article 5 guarantees to Ukraine. And I think everything else is commentary. I understand why this question of how much Ukrainian territory Ukraine ends up holding after the war is one that matters to Ukrainians on humanitarian grounds, on political grounds, on sort of symbolic grounds. But I understand why status of Crimea might matter to Ukrainians. But in the end, I think the sort of necessary and sufficient condition for sustainable peace is that Ukraine be in the alliance when this is over in some shape or form. And I think Ukrainians understand that as well. And I think that's what they are trying to get. And my hope is that after November, it might be easier, but I'm not really all that hopeful. I mean, we've seen very few signals from Democrats and even fewer signals from Republicans that this would be an option. And so if that's not available, then that really sort of puts Ukrainians in a bind. And I think that without something like NATO membership, it's just like the sort of talk of like negotiated solutions is completely far-fetched. I mean, there won't be a negotiated solution short of NATO membership. There could only be a sort of military defeat one way or another, or a sort of protracted war, or one that can periodically freeze or unfreeze and will go on for years, maybe longer.
Yeah, I think we're right to point to the dangers of that, and as we will also hear at least allusions to it in the segment that we recorded with Professor Nye, the West, led by future President Harris, if that is the case, will always have the possibility of framing this defeat as a win. Putin did not get all of Ukraine, but I think therein lies the danger. I adhere to the 1-point plan, but to me, there's also an important asterisk there, and that is beyond the bits and pieces for territory and the very crucial question indeed about war reparations. It's quite scandalous how the Vance plan is proposing that Ukraine pay for its own war reparations. But putting all of those critical points to the side, independent of NATO or not membership, I think Crimea is important because it is about the self-sustainability long-term of Ukraine as an independent economy, independent of Western aid. And so in this context, comments that we've seen this week, in the past week, from Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, about a possible UN referendum in Crimea, apart from issues of international legality, I think is not constructive because we all know that Russia has entirely modified the demographics of Crimea prior to 2014, but particularly after. So I felt the need of mentioning that in the context of possible peace plans. The one other thing that I think we should mention in this context is that independent of US elections, we are now in this massive and much announced on this podcast election cycle in Europe as well, with Europeans at the regional level as well as at the national level having crucial elections that continue and will continue to have a massive impact, including on the outcome of the war. And so looking back and looking ahead, maybe we can start with the exit polls out of the third so-called Eastern German state, where we, after a previous absolute defeat of the Social Democrats, to which party Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, belongs in the third election. Now we have exit polls from Brandenburg saying that in this case, Chancellor Scholz's party, SPD, has come out with its incumbent in first place, trailed by probably a couple or a few points behind by the Alternative for Germany. So that's good news in the context of really bad news of the rise of the far right in Germany.
So I'm not an expert on German politics, so I want to ask you this. Was there any chance that if Social Democrats had been summarily defeated in Brandenburg, that would have led to some changes within the party or within the coalition government that could have possibly positioned sort of centrist pro-Ukrainian forces on a stronger footing ahead of the federal election, or was that never going to happen?
I'm afraid that was not going to happen given the political predisposition, if you'd like, and then election outcomes in that vein of voters in the former Eastern German states. None of the preferred parties, indifferent of the combination of outcomes, are the ones that are openly pro-Ukraine, and that is maybe also a specificity of of the German political landscape. The ones that have been more staunchly for Ukraine are the Greens, and the Greens have been doing decent, but it's just not enough in Eastern German elections. The SPD, remember, we have former Chancellor Schröder on Russia's pay bill, still a member of that party. That sends a very strong message and is disabling of any discussions within the SPD of Chancellor Scholz perhaps becoming a bit more pro-Ukrainian. The large center-right opposition party CDU that has done well in one of the three states in elections is very conservative when it comes to the economy, which is not in favor of Ukraine in the long term. And then, of course, the looming doom and gloom is both on the far right as well as on the far left, and those are openly anti-Ukraine and increasingly pro-Russian parties. So I'm afraid that was not in the cards, and I don't have high expectations on that. Dalibor, as we're moving slowly east, we have a couple more countries to go. There's right next to Germany, Austria, with looming elections. What's your estimate or speculation in terms of how that's going to turn out in the elections that we have coming up on Sunday, the 29th of September?
So I think most polls put FPÖ, the Freedom Party Austria, in the lead. I think that lead has been narrowing somewhat in recent weeks and days. Austrian electoral system is such that you typically have coalition governments emerging after elections, oftentimes after protracted negotiations. FPÖ has been in and out of government since early noughties, so it's not going to be a sort of earth-shattering result even if they do come first, and they'll have to get a first pick at the chancellor, and they'll still have to make compromises. They've sort of played this game before. They are pro-Russian, there is no way around that, but there is something deeper about Austrian political culture and the sort of commitment to neutrality and the fact that the country has really done very little to decouple itself from Russian energy after 2022, like Slovaks and Hungarians, unfortunately. So it's really sort of part of this group of countries that are trying to do as little as possible and try to kind of move on from the present situation, go back to business as usual with Russia. So I don't think that will change. At the same time, Austrians, I don't think, have the sort of ambition of playing the sort of hubristic role that Viktor Orban is playing on the European stage, and not trying to sort of coalesce nationalistic forces behind them into some kind of unified anti-Western front, which is what Orban is doing. But it's not going to make things easier, that's for sure. The other election I was going to bring up is a regional and Senate election that took place in the Czech Republic next door over this past weekend, where Andrej Babiš's ANO movement did really well, and the results for a bit put a question mark over the governing coalition, which includes the Pirates Party, which apparently are undergoing some sort of internal schism about whether they should be staying in the government or not. There is a part of the party membership who believe that staying in government basically reduces their chances of getting into the next parliament in 2025. So I think that immediate sort of danger to the governing coalition has been mitigated, so business as usual continues, but Babiš's strong results suggest that he might be the one forming the next Czech government. And most of my Czech friends say that this would be a different Andrej Babiš from the sort of managerial technocratic prime minister that the Czech Republic had already once as part of a coalition agreement with Social Democrats. So the version of Babiš who would be returning to power next year is one who would be probably more openly pro-Russian, pro-Chinese, kind of, all-around dodgy, trying to protect himself from criminal investigations. And especially if he is not held back by a coalition arrangements that include centrist mainstream parties like the Social Democrats or somebody else, that things can take an ugly turn quickly, and the odds are that he would be really looking for coalition parties on the extreme right or sort of on the fringes of the political spectrum rather than among sort of more respectable centrist political forces. So that's a looming danger ahead. Thankfully, don't have to worry about it quite yet, but it might be coming.
Yeah, if I am to wrap up and sort of look back at what we've discussed in the last couple of minutes, it does seem to be a geographic focus. And if you're looking at Eastern Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, so far I'll stop here, but who knows what's next? We have more elections coming up in October in Moldova, in November in Romania, instability in Bulgaria, so we can definitely look south at some point too. But so far it looks like in that piece of the east, what we call the Eastern Front, the resistance seems to be, that was already shaky from the beginning, seems to be crumbling, and Putin's influence seems to be more successful. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Now we'll move on to the next segment with Professor Joseph Nye. So we're joined today by Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University. Thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So let's get started with a very broad question. Of course, we are hoping to find out everything about how you're seeing soft power in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. So to get us started off, I'd ask you the broad question of who is winning this war in Europe? You recently, a few months ago, argued that one can coerce by economic means. Russia is now the most sanctioned country on earth, but it still has what seems to be unlimited resources when it comes to ammunition. No one wants to move to Russia, but lots of people are trying to move to the West. But on the other hand, Russia seems to be popular in the global South, including when it comes to the economy. So what is it with Russia and economic coercion? Are we failing? Is Russia an exception? Who's winning and who's losing in this war?
Well, on the question of who's winning and who's losing, it depends on what you think the objectives are and what time horizon you're thinking about. In some sense, if Putin's war objectives were to remove Ukraine as an independent entity, in other words, to not recognize their sovereignty or to put in a totally compliant puppet government in Kyiv, then Russia's lost. And it lost within a few weeks by the effective resistance that Ukraine put up. And since that, if you believe what Putin wrote in 2021 about Ukraine, just before the invasion in February 22, you can make a case that Putin has already lost the war in that sense. If, on the other hand, you look at the objectives as Ukraine recovering all the territory that Russia has taken from them since 2014, including Crimea, then obviously the war is stalemated. And the prospects of Ukraine accomplishing that in any near term do not look encouraging. So, in that sense, a victory in one sense, a stalemate in the other. And of course, if you think about time horizons, the game's not over. The danger I see, however, is that Putin believes that time is on his side. And with the larger country and resources, he has a point. So the question then is, how does the West, how do Ukraine play their hands in this situation? Economic sanctions, as you mentioned, did not bring Russia to its knees. In the short term, very short term, they had an impact, but then in the medium term, they have not changed Russian policy. Over the longer term, they probably will have an effect on Russia, but that long term has not fully materialized yet. So in that sense, I think the definitions of winning and losing are very dependent upon the time horizons you specify.
If I may, you wrote some time ago that seduction tends to be more effective than coercion, and values like democracy, human rights, and individual opportunities are deeply seductive. And it strikes me that this sort of cultural pull is an important component of soft power. One only has to go to Ukraine and Georgia, Moldova to see the sort of ubiquity of European flags and people sort of professing their commitment to European integration in a way that's reminiscent of the 1990s in Central and Eastern Europe. However, when you step back and you look at especially this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and you sort of wonder who has overperformed and who has underperformed expectations in terms of soft power, it strikes me as fair to say that Russia seems to be overperforming expectations. Unlike in the Cold War, the Russians don't really have an appealing cultural or ideological sort of body of thought to offer to the world, right? And during the Cold War, there were many earnest communists in the West who were gravitating towards ideas of Soviet communism. Russia right now is, just inserting itself into culture wars in the West and spreading disinformation without offering anything positive. And the West, we still should be standing for democracy and human rights and freedom, yet much of the so-called global South is more than willing to just sit this war out completely and not join in any sanctions regime, not really to go out of their way to be helpful. Is this a sort of fair reading of the situation, or am I missing something here? Is Russia overperforming expectations and the West underperforming? And what can be done about it, if that's a fair assessment?
Well, when one thinks of power, which is the ability to get others to do what you want, there are three ways to do it. One is by coercion, the other is by payment, and the third is by attraction, or what you refer to as seduction. Again, the difference between hard power, which is coercion or payment, and soft power, which is attraction, has a lot to do with time horizons. For example, if I want to steal your money and I take out a gun and shoot you, I can get your money instantaneously, and it doesn't matter what you think. But if I want to steal your money by persuading you that I am a guru and that you should willingly give it to me, and then I run off on a vacation, then that takes time. It takes quite a lot of time persuading against and seducing you into believing that I'm a guru. In that sense, I think the situation that we see in Ukraine and Russia is that Russia doesn't have much seductive power, doesn't have much attraction, and it is using that analogy of take out a gun and shoot you. But if we ask, will that work in the long run? I don't think so, but we don't know. But even if the long run is uncertain, notice that soft power still can play a role in the short run. Look at, for example, the success that Zelensky had putting on his green T-shirt and appearing on television and the internet and visiting various parliaments and making Ukraine attractive. That increased Ukraine's soft power, and he was able to translate that into hard power of military and economic assistance. So the different types of power, hard and soft, have, again, very different time horizons, but even in the short time horizon, soft power can make some difference. When you ask about the so-called global South, which is a terrible misnomer because there are many countries and some of them aren't south of the equator, many of these countries are approaching this not because they are attracted to Russia, but out of simple realpolitik terms. If you take India, which is now the largest country in population in the world, which is often called a leader of the global South, though it's above the equator, India is playing this as a question of how do I get cheap oil? How do I make sure I don't lose my Russian armaments contracts? And how do I make sure that the Russian-China relationship doesn't get stronger at my costs? So this is a very hard power calculation, if you want, that India is engaging in. And many other countries that used to be called non-aligned are doing the same thing. There are a few cases where there is soft power in such countries for Russia. For example, in South Africa, there's a little residual attraction to Russia because of Russia's role against apartheid. And there's some other countries that have similar attitudes. But by and large, Russia doesn't have much soft power, and it's relying on hard power. And whether this will be sufficient for the long run, I think is very much an open question.
I suppose that one part of the story is geographic distance, that the further away you are from Russia, the more likely it is that the Russians will be able to sell you some idea of what Russia stands for and how it actually behaves. But are you worried at all about the West's collective ability to persuade or seduce countries. It strikes me that attraction that the European Union, the United States exercised on countries of Central and Eastern Europe, partly by being able to bring them into NATO and the EU, that we sort of our ability to sort of be the shining city on the hill and bring countries to our cause through mere persuasion has declined somewhat in recent years. Would you agree with that, or is that not something that you're worried about too much?
Well, if one looks at Europe and looks at the disposition of countries in Europe, there are one or two, Hungary, maybe Slovakia, which are attracted to Russia, but the rest are obviously not. And on the contrary, NATO is stronger today than it has been before the invasion of Ukraine. And so if Putin's objectives were to undercut the legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent state and to thereby weaken NATO, he's failed in both those objectives. He's had just the opposite effects of what he said. So I think in Europe, you can see the effect of soft power as a long-run process in the sense that at the end of the Cold War, as a Norwegian analyst once put it, Europe was divided into two empires, a Russian empire and an American empire, or a Soviet empire and American empire. But the difference, as he put it, was the American empire was an empire by invitation. The Russian was an empire by coercion, as we saw with the movements into Budapest in 56 and into Prague in 68. In that sense, you could argue that in the longer term of history, soft power was more important than hard power. Russia maintained its empire by hard power, but if you take 20, 30-year horizon, the soft power was more important. That's not much consolation when you're fighting a war with people being killed every day, as is happening in Ukraine. But it does mean that from a historical analysis, we have to make sure that we're clear about what's short run, medium term, and long run as we analyze the effects of different types of power.
So now that we're delving deeper into the West, I also want to ask you, Professor Nye, to look ahead in terms of, I guess, the future of the West in the context of this war, but maybe most centrally in the context of the upcoming elections here in the United States. It seems to me that when we're looking from the outside, the two competing candidates are offering different versions of the future of the West, but they're not entirely opposite. So Trump is offering MAGA, Make America Great Again. That is resonating in terms of deep isolationism. And in the context of this war, the largest scale war in Europe in 70 years, he's offering a somewhat undefined or vague proposition of peace in which we would most likely have Ukraine being forced into neutrality, at least for the time being, losing territory. So in a sense, Russia not getting entirely, going back to our initial conversation, not getting entirely what it wants, but also not on the losing end. And so if we look at this prospect, what does that mean for the power of attraction of the West in the context of also by invitation only, what you were just saying, but these invitations in the context of Ukraine, and hence then also Georgia, Moldova, and others remaining elusive. And then we have an alternative, and you correct me if you see that I'm not describing it in the way that you think I should, with Vice President Harris being vague about how she would see the future of Ukraine and the West. Currently, President Zelensky is heading to New York to the General Assembly, and he's saying, one of my objectives is to present my vision, my peace plan to Vice President Harris, because I do not know exactly what she thinks of it, to what extent she supports it. So it might be possible that we have a Democrat in the White House that will, in a gentler way, impose a peace process onto Ukraine, where Ukraine again is left out of the West. So with these two alternatives, how does the West look like for you under US leadership in the 1 or 2 years to come?
Well, let me start by saying it's, I think, essential that the democratic countries or the West make clear that Putin has not won this war. And that goes back to the point that I started with, that in terms of his own initial objectives, he has not won this war. And if a peace is imposed upon Ukraine, I think that would be a big mistake in terms of the credibility and the attractiveness of the West. Trump has said in his public statements that he would bring about a peace immediately in a day. It's hard to see how he does that without capitulating to Putin's terms. And I think that would mean a defeat for Ukraine and for the West. On the other hand, one never knows what Trump means by his statements. He has a long record of playing with ambiguity. And so what I said was a hypothetical. If Trump were to indeed win and then were to impose a peace in a day, then I think that would be the effect. Harris, on the other hand, is part of the Biden administration, and so she can't get too far off the reservation in expressing an independent position. I would expect that she would continue the Biden approach, which essentially is that you cannot impose a peace on Ukraine, and that even if Ukraine decides it's going to have an armistice, a so-called Korea type situation, this has to be Ukraine's decision, not imposed upon it by the US or by the West. So I think there is a considerable difference between the two candidates in terms of what they stand for. I have just finished, or this year I finished a memoir called Is the American Century Over?, which deals with this question. Well, the book is titled Life in the American Century, but essentially it's asking that question of is it over? And I said I have a guarded optimism that it is not over. Could we make serious mistakes? Could things go seriously off the track? Yes, that's history. I mean, life is unpredictable. Is that most likely? I think not. But again, the West has to also leave room for uncertainty. And that's why I ended this Life in the American Century with what I call guarded optimism.
I think that's an excellent note on which we can wrap this up. Professor and I were always struggling on this podcast for obvious reasons to end on a positive note, but you just handed it to us with guarded optimism. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I hope all goes well.
And on to our last segment for today's recommendation. I have a longer piece. It's called Russia's Espionage War in the Arctic. It's written by Ben Taub for The New Yorker from a few days ago. It's a very long piece and it's a little bit out of our geographic remit, but I definitely think it's worth a read because it's beautifully written, a bit like an espionage novel, like a chapter in an espionage novel. You'll find out about weaponized migrants from the Middle East that end up in the Arctic and that they are not always what they seem to be. Many of them speak Russian, have been living in Russia for a long time, and also about fisher boats that are not what they seem and others too. And I'll read this one very brief paragraph to give you an idea of what you'd be in for in terms of a treat. The Russians were invited to send observers to an exercise in the Arctic, partly as a gesture of transparency. They declined, and that doesn't mean they weren't there. During the exercise, men with Eastern European accents reportedly tried to buy Norwegian military IDs from drunk conscripts at a bar. The paucity of accommodations in remote Arctic towns towns make them ripe for spontaneous encounters with high-value targets and their devices. Once, as I was having a reindeer burger at a crowded hotel bar, the heads of both the Norwegian and the Swedish armed forces brushed past my chair. For more, have a look at the article, and thank you so much from the Eastern Front. Thank you for listening to us, a podcast on the security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter or X, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to have a look at and discuss. If you enjoy this podcast, consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get them. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.